experiencing at that time, and still, of course, are today. But I always found that book oddly ironic for a couple of reasons. Now, of course, on the one hand, it was the irony of white folks only being able to hear the truth when spoken by a white man who was simply playing at black for a few months. That was the first irony, but that was the obvious one. The other one, which I didn't think about for many, many years after, was that in effect what teachers were saying when they were asking white people, and let's face it, it was white people being asked. I mean, teachers weren't asking black kids to read Black Like Me so they'd understand what it meant to be black. I mean, they sort of knew the drill, you know? And so when white young people were being asked to read this book, the implicit assumption, never stated, but implicit nonetheless, was that the only way one can really understand race in America is to think of it as a black issue, or perhaps a Latino issue, or Asian issue, indigenous issue. In other words, to look at it through the eyes of the other. Well, now, on the one hand, there is value to seeing and hearing the perspectives of the other, the real other, not the fake other playing games for several months, real black and brown folks, but then it's still ironic because it allows whites to keep in place that idea that says race is not a white issue. Right? So it's a black issue. So if you read Black Like Me, you'll understand race. But you yourself, as a white person, age 16 or 17, being asked to read this book, you wouldn't understand race unless you read this book. But now that's nonsense, because by the time we're asked to read John Howard Griffin's version of it, we have been living in whiteface for 17 years. And we have experienced plenty of what race is about, whether we've recognized it as such or not. Whether we're willing to acknowledge it and to address it or not, we've been living it. So I thought, how much more valuable might it be to ask white folks to start where they are and ask themselves what it means to be exactly who they are, not something that they're not and something they can never really understand, because I don't care how many books you read by peoples of color and how many interviews you hear them give on radio stations or how many speeches you hear them give. To be white is to never fully understand that, but now to be white is to be raced and to have racialized experiences. And it is my contention that if white folks were clear on what it means to be exactly what we are, we'd have a real damn good understanding of what it means to be anything else. So let us begin at the beginning. And so that is why I wanted to write this book, to encourage this discussion. What does it mean to be white in a country set up for the benefit of people like you and for the institutional destruction of everybody else? What does that mean? Surely it must mean something. Now, we use language to obscure this, right? We use, and I don't mean reactionaries. I mean, they use language to obscure everything. I mean liberals, who are as good at it as anyone. Nice white liberals who use and I'm talking about like service providers. You know who I'm talking about, folks that help people. You know, service, and you know what the word is they use when they want to talk about the people they're serving. What's the term we use for the folks on the bottom of the social, political, economic hierarchy? You know the word underprivileged. We want to help the underprivileged. I don't know how many of y'all are English majors. I don't know how many of y'all just paid attention in third grade grammar, but if you just did that, you'd automatically recognize the problem with a term like underprivileged. Two problems. Number one, it's a passive term, right? It doesn't imply that anybody did anything to anyone. It's just there's privilege and I'll be damned, there you are under it. And if we could just figure out how you got down there, it would all be cool in the carpool. But now we don't know how you got down there. It's osmosis. 83% of tenured faculty in American colleges, white men. How'd that happen? Don't know. Don't want to know. 95% of senior management in corporations in America, white men. How'd that happen? Don't know. Don't want to know. Underprivileged, privilege up there. How'd you get there? Don't know. Don't want to know. It obscures the active component of oppression. Stuff doesn't just happen. Contrary to the bumper sticker wisdom of some, stuff gets done by people to people. That's problem number one with the language we use, so that's why we don't understand what it means to be privileged. We don't even want to acknowledge there is such a thing as privilege. The second problem with the term is that it's a relative term, right? Under is by definition relative. This ain't ideology. This, again, is grammar. What is under relative to? Over. But you hadn't heard the word overprivileged in polite conversation. So much so that if you go home tonight after this talk, I'm daring you, I am betting you, get on Microsoft Word. If that's the word processor you're running, get on Microsoft Word, type in the word underprivileged, and your spell check will recognize that word. Now type in the word overprivileged, and watch how fast that little red line pops up. Because you see, Microsoft, and notice the irony, Microsoft does not understand the concept of overprivilege. And if Microsoft doesn't get it, then it won't shock you that the vast majority of people don't get it either. We know what the term underclass means. We know exactly who politicians and talking heads in the media are referring to when they say the underclass. They mean low-income folks of color in urban settings. But now under is relative to over, and we don't say overclass in polite conversation, but by definition there must be one. So we obscure all this so that even the nice liberal service-providing, progressive-minded people who want to help people aren't really, because they're failing to interrogate what it means to be on top, what it means to be the dominant group. And as a result, we leave in place the mentality that race is just an issue for people of color. Oh, it is an issue for people of color. But if it wasn't a white issue first, people of color wouldn't be having to sweat it. That's the point. And so we have to interrogate that. And the target for this analysis, frankly, and the target for my book, when I wrote it, people were asking, well, now who is this for, Tim? Because for a lot of your writing, this is what folks would say, who are always trying to give you advice. A lot of your writing is awfully, shall we say, uncompromising. And a lot of your speeches, you're not, don't seem to be real concerned about bringing people in who are on the fence. And it has always amazed me how other folks will seek to define for me who my audience is and who I'm writing for, talking for. I've always contended people who are on the fence are there because they like the feeling of the fence on their ass. And they're not likely to commit to anything because commitment requires them to move in one direction or another, and that is uncomfortable. If I was writing for people on the fence, I'd be writing the same stuff for a long time, getting nowhere. That's not what I'm concerned about, and I don't think it's what we as progressives and radicals ought to be concerned about. I write and I do the work I do principally because what I have seen and what I have been guilty of myself, and I talk about this in the book. Because there's no space for white radicals to say, oh, we're the good whites and those are the bad whites. That's all nonsense. That's stuff we pump when we don't want to be accountable for our own screw-ups, which happen weekly. And so I talk about it in the book that I have been a part of a white left that for too long has undermined the racial analysis that we need in order to be an effective movement-building force. We have downplayed race. We have ignored race. We have marginalized race. We've wanted to talk about anything but race. And when people of color on the left want to talk race, we demean it as identity politics or changing the issue in ways that are every bit as offensive, maybe more so than when the right does that, because at least we expect that from the right. But when white folks who call themselves leftists and progressives don't want to talk about race and their own privileges, then we have a real problem. And so books like this are not meant for conservatives. I mean, if they want to read it and have their little come to Jesus moment, then God bless them. But now that's not who they need to be written for, and that's not the audience for whom we speak or to whom we speak. Too often times we have minimized and downplayed the role of race in the issues of social justice, whether it's environmentalist so-called, ignoring the very particularistic role of environmental racism within the larger movement for ecological sustainability, whether it is an anti-war movement that is so committed to the idea that the war we are currently fighting is only about oil, that it's only an economic, pro-corporate, money motivation, that they're not even willing to ask themselves the much more fundamental question, which is what in the hell gave us the idea that we were entitled to the oil in the first place? And the answer to that isn't just capitalism. The answer to that is white world supremacy. And if we aren't clear on the motivation for this behavior, The motivation that leads us to believe that certain countries run by white or so-called white people are entitled to have weapons of mass destruction, and as many of them as we want. But other nations run by peoples of color are not. Then we're talking about white world supremacy. If we're going to have a policy announced by Dick Cheney in the aftermath of 9/11 that we're going to fight the war on terrorism against as many as 50 countries, this is what the man said. And then you do a little digging and you find that Al-Qaeda operates in 64 countries. And I was a little confused, because, hell, if we're going to fight this thing, let's fight this thing. You got 64 enemies, you're only going to fight 50. What kind of half-assed war is that? And then you start digging to find out, well, now who's the 14 that we're not going to pay any attention to? Because I want to know. Oh, but you see, that's 12 European nations, the U.S. and Canada. The other 50